100 pounds of weed in a car if you had to carry it back to your hometown? Would you borrow your grandma's jalopy RV or your little sister's Civic Honda? I'll tell you, I surely wouldn't recommend either one of those alternatives. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about how our crew brokered and packed our typical 90 to 100 pound loads. Most of the time, when we arrived at the farm, Tiny or Trey hadn't brokered the load yet because they were waiting for us to bring them the money. Every blue moon, the load would be ready for us to take out the very next day, but that was a very rare thing. The thing is, when it comes to brokering, credit isn't usually a part of any of the transactions. It's a cash-only basis. Brokering weed is strictly cash. And a crap load of it, too. I once watched a guy count out $70,000 by hand for the load that Trey was buying from him. Imagine counting that much money by hand with no money counting machine. It took him over an hour. Oh my gosh, think of how filthy his hands were by then. Remember when I told you how dirty our hands became after counting money with the machine? Think of counting all that by hand. No, thank you. I mean, I count it by hand rather than just trusting, but still, I guess this is what you call a first world problem. Here's how grow operations worked up in NorCal before they legalized it recreationally back in 2016. I'm not sure how it works exactly nowadays. It's kind of confusing, so I'll make it short and not particularly thorough. The county recorder decided how many plants a farm could have, which was determined by how big it was. Then, the number of plots on the farm determined how many 215 cards would be issued to people per farm. Only one person can have one 215 card, and each 215 card gives the card holder permission to grow 25 plants. At the time, at that rate, Tiny's farm could have had up to 150 plants on his 315-acre farm. He actually never grew more than 100 plants because they would have had to go through too many legal hoops to subdivide the farm into 6 plots, and they weren't prepared to do that at the time. Also, Trey and Tiny were already buying so much weight every month from the farms around them that they didn't want to draw attention from the California DEA to themselves. That many plants would have made the rest of the neighbors really nervous and sketched out. There's a kind of unspoken rule up in the triangle not to draw too much attention to yourselves because it brings unwanted attention to the rest of the neighbors. The rule of thumb is keep your damn head down. So the boys never grew more than 100 plants at a time because they just wanted to stay under the radar of California DEA. Well, so much for that. I guess you could say they actually did stay under California's DEA radar, just not Utah's DEA radar. Everybody automatically thinks that DEA is a federal entity, so DEA should be the same everywhere. Not true. The California DEA, they were dealing with a lot more cartels bringing in hardcore drugs like meth, heroin, and all their derivatives. And those kind of things pose actual dangers to public safety, more than, say, Utah DEA, who have way less hardcore drug crime than they do in California. California DEA and county sheriffs were also assigned to come down on weed farmers with regard to deeply problematic state environmental issues like occasional growers who were poisoning the rivers and streams with pesticides, or chasing illegal grow operations off federal land and illegally depleting the water tables during the 10-year drought out there. There was always fights between almond tree farmers, fruit farmers, water bottling companies, and weed farmers over water rights and allotments in the state. If a farmer was growing too many plants, California DEA didn't necessarily arrest the grower as much as they would just helicopter in and burn the crop down. DEA couldn't usually find those kind of farmers anyway, because by then the farmers and growers were literally lost in the woods, never to return again until next season. California DEA and county sheriffs had a lot more pressing issues on their plate than to be wasting their time and their budget money chasing down stupid head weed dealer growers and such. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Tiny and Trey usually had already started trying to figure out arrangements as to who they were going to buy from before we arrived with the money. They would drive over to a certain farmer to parlay. They would have the farmer put the word out that a Utah broker was looking to buy 100 pounds. Because of the growing restrictions that I just described to you, not only one person could really supply Trey with all the weight he wanted to purchase. After the money arrived, Trey or Tiny would go hang out at the farmer's place all day while the farmer ran around to each of his buddies' operations to tell them to bring 5 to 10 pounds of their product to present. The farmer had incentive to make sure the brokers had other buyers there too at his farm because the broker paid the farmer a commission. All throughout the day, different farmers would trickle in, bringing their product in plastic turkey 1-pound bags to give a look and hopefully receive an offer. Trey would inspect the product and decide if he was going to buy that particular offering. This was all done the old-fashioned way, completely analog, meaning no cell phones. First of all, many farmers were paranoid about having cell phones. They were terrified the man was listening in. I used to roll my eyes at these silly, superstitious boys. I figured they were just smoking way too much weed. But now, I'm kind of like-minded with those boys these days. Second of all, the cell phone service was sketchy at best out in the middle of butt-fuck nowhere. For most people out in the coastal mountains, Verizon seemed to be the phone service of choice at the time because they had the most bandwidth out in the triangle at that time. Can you imagine what the stock market in New York City or the commodities market in Chicago would be like without cell phone service? It would be like using 2 paper cups tied together on a long string, hollering at each other over the trading floor. I need 10 pounds of sour diesel. Okay, got 2 pounds of Blue Dream locked in at $8.50 a pound. No, man, I said 10 pounds of sour diesel. Roger that. 11 pounds of Girl Scout cookies at $9.50. Believe it or not, this was a shit show that actually kind of worked most of the time. But because of the antiquated type of system, being a broker wasn't nearly as glamorous of a job as it might seem. It was a lot more ground roots type of thing. Often, Tiny and Trey would sit around at the farmers waiting for sales, sometimes for over 5 to 12 hours. Many times they would wait and no one would even show up. Ugh. Colin succinctly described what being a broker was like for him. Being a broker means waiting around for people to lie to me. Bob and I even had to wait at some of the places with trays so that we could get the product packed on the premises and get on our way with the load. Do you have any idea what it's like to sit around for 5 to 9 hours at a wildly lush, beautiful place that doesn't have internet or electricity? It's okay for about the first 20 minutes, then it gets old really fast. During the times Tiny and Trey were sitting around waiting for people to lie to them, Bob and I were sitting around waiting too. We couldn't go anywhere without the load, and sometimes we waited over 3 days. And then there's the all-time record that we waited for back in September of 2014. 5 days. The distributor Chetta was back in Salt Lake, going stark raving crazy, waiting on us. We were supposed to make a super quick turnaround and be back by the 3rd day. Instead, we arrived with the load in Salt Lake City 5 days late. Seriously, I thought Bob Benson was gonna lose his shit over that one. Mostly Bob lost his shit about having to wait on anything, period. Bob Benson is all about the point of the journey is the damn destination. He's not one of those enjoy the journey kind of guys. He's a terrible waiter. He has always been an impatient person. He's a man on a mission with things to do and places to go. He gets cranky and impatient. No amount of picnics, walks, or meditations along the Eel River at Redwood State Park is distraction enough for him. He was okay with going to the Redway Tibetan antique store or hiking the Ewok forest in Arcata for an hour or so. But after basically 2 beers and an hour and a half, he was over it. Over it. Me, I loved going to the Pee Bookstore in Garberville. I could spend hours and hours in that stinky place. I bought so many cool art books and picture books on the Russian Revolution for under $1 to $5 a piece. After a while, my nose didn't even notice the smell. But the smell of that place made Bob even more hateful. He used the F word a lot. So rude. He paced around the store, cussing at the long-haired cat that had made the smell in the first place, and watching his burner phone like a race car driver timing himself on the track. We stayed in amazing cool bed and breakfast places in Gualala, California, Yosemite, and we went to the spa at the 4-star Hilton in Santa Rosa, which has since burned to the ground, while we waited as the boys rooted around for product. Let me tell you, it was a hard job waiting around for the brokers, but someone had to do it. I loved this job. Depending on what the season was at the time, determined what the wholesale price was. This was pure capitalism at its finest. Supply and demand, baby. Supply and demand. If you understand the farming cycle, then you can better understand pricing to an extent. As you can imagine, prices began skyrocketing beginning around June as supply started depleting. Prices really started blowing up the last quarter of the year in July, especially in August and September, just before the harvest. The smart, disciplined, and lucky farmers held on to their product until July or August so they could sell product at the highest price of the year. But it was hard to do that, though, because most farmers needed the money from the harvest to finance daily living expenses and next year's farm supplies and costs. Wheat farmers kind of lived a feast and famine type of existence. They were flush in the winter, eating out, dating girls, buying new trucks, and going on exotic vacations after the holidays. But come summer, they lived a lot more meagerly. When the trimmers came in to help with the harvest, the way most farmers paid these trimmers was often in kind. After the trimming was done, trimmers would return to their local towns in November with anywhere from 2 to 10 pounds of ganja bags to unload on the streets. This dynamic of paying trimmers in kind used to put a big dent in our sales in Salt Lake during those months of November and December, and we had to wait out the trimmer weed influx going on in town until about the end of December. As a broker, Tiny loved to drive a hard bargain. It was one of his most favorite things to do. Boy, could he grind people down. He never had a problem with blinking first. He could keep those baby blues of his open all night long if he had to. He never thought twice of driving 200 miles to find a great deal, but instead walk away because it wasn't $5 cheaper. However, Colin couldn't broker all the time because he had too many hats to wear, so most of the brokering fell to Trey. Occasionally, Tiny would get so pissed at Trey because he thought Trey had brokered a shitty deal or paid too much for the product or he wasn't buying high enough quality. Trey always had a soft heart for the farmers. Colin ragged on Trey sometimes till Trey was ready to punch Tiny in the face. Colin had kind of a double standard of excellence. I remember one time, as a favor, Tiny instructed Trey to buy some kind of unearthly cheap but crappy product from one of Tiny's close friends. Trey balked hard at the subpar purchase, but he still went ahead and did what Colin told him to do. Turned out it was the shittiest 200 pounds of product that the hoppers this side of the Rocky Mountains had ever seen. I thought we were never going to get rid of that crap. The hoppers kept bringing it back saying, "My customers hate this garbage." Finally, they unloaded the crap for pennies on the dollar over on the west side. We almost lost some of our best clientele over this issues till we were able to turn things around. Tiny blamed Trey over the bad buy. Oh, I thought the two of them were going to go to blows over this. Trey was so incensed that Colin was blaming him. Let's put it this way. Brokering takes a lot of skill, and it's not really so easy. Boy, can I go down some rabbit holes on all this info. So, back to the job at hand. Finally, when the deal was done, it was time to pack and prepare the precious load for transport. The product had to be divided, weighed, bagged, sealed, labeled, securely packed, and hidden before we could take off. Hidden in the car is what I mean. Like I told you before, the one who was in charge of the travel preparations depended on the deal between the broker and the sub-broker, the commissioned farmer. Lots of times, the farmer would pay a couple of available farm workers on that respective farm $100 or $200 to help out. This packing process usually took anywhere from 3 to 5 hours, so it wasn't a super easy thing to do. When the brokers went to buy, they always took their equipment with them: a big scale, 2 sealers, plastic to seal, labels, markers for labeling, and surgery gloves to keep fingerprints off the bags. Pretty smart, huh? If there was no electricity at the place that we were packing, they had to fire up the generators till we were done. Not only did we bring the cash out with us, Bob and I brought a big black blanket and 5 waterproof bags with us from Salt Lake. Once in a while, Trey would call us the night before and ask us to stop at Walmart and pick up 3 to 4 more sealers. These NorCal brokers rode those sealers so hard that the sealers never lasted more than 2 to 3 buys. Seriously, most of the Walmarts that we went into up in NorCal, they had their own complete aisles for the sealers alone. Walmart made a shit ton of profit off the weed industry. Sometimes, after a long day of brokering, the boys on our own farm would pack during the bewitching hours after 12 a.m. as they cranked up the wrap and got to work. Bob and I never helped with packing that late. We went to sleep because we had to get up at dawn to be able to get to Portland or Boise before 10 p.m. the next day. Sometimes Bob and I helped pack if it was in the day. The faster it was packed, the faster we could get on our way. I met a lot of really nice guys who were farmers, brokers, and workers up in the Triangle through the packing process. I'll tell you, none of those boys could pack the bags the way Dad could. Man, oh man, Dad was the only guy up on the mountain and in the Triangle that could Tetris 20 one-pound bags into a big waterproof canvas bag. The really good packers could get about 18 to 19 one-pound bags in a big bag, but Dad was the only one who could really Tetris that many bags into the big bag, including the overage. That's what all the boys used to call Bob, Dad. Like gangsters in the 20s, most weed people have aliases. The boys in our crew affectionately called Bob Dad. In fact, all over the Triangle, Bob was known as Dad. I was known mostly as Trinity, unless people were referring to us both, and then we were known as Mom and Dad. Although very few people in Salt Lake knew we ran weed, a lot of people up in the Triangle who didn't even know us referred to us as Mom and Dad, and Trey as the baby. A lot of times when we would arrive at some hidden farm to pick up, people would say to us, "So you're Mom and Dad." That always made us kind of nervous, being that infamous. That's not really a good thing when you're a driver. I wouldn't be surprised if even the feds called us Mom and Dad in their investigations too. See, Mom and Dad, that's the target. See, on the top 10 fugitives of the nation. See, Mom and Dad with the baby, armed and dangerous. See? Let's see. I was talking about overage. After all the weighing, sealing, and packing, there was always a pound or two of product left over. That was an intentional thing from each seller. You would never want to damage your reputation and sell less than you said you were providing. Giving a bit more than required was the way weed people did business everywhere. It created goodwill. It also gave ample opportunity for sampling and enticing customers. And while our distributors use some of the overage, mostly they pass it on to the hoppers down the line, and the hoppers did the same with their good customers, and so forth and so on. Did I mention before we also brought a king-size black blanket with us? I think I did. So anyway, why would we bring a king-size dark blanket with us? Well, of course, to cover up the bags, because at least one of the 5 bags would stick up over the window line in most of the SUVs we rented. It was kind of cool too, because looking through the tinted windows from the outside, the dark blanket gave the illusion that there was nothing in the back of the SUV. The reflection of the tinted windows and the black blanket on the inside just made the back seat look like it was empty. That came in handy when a cop was tailing our ass. Before I end this episode, I would like to talk a little bit about money. Now, mind you, since legalization has started in so many states throughout the nation, things are much different now. The bottom has fallen out of the price of weed, so I'm just going to talk about how it used to be. And how it used to be was a lot more lucrative then. During the years that we were involved, the wholesale price for large buys and different strains usually fluctuated throughout the year, anywhere from $850 a pound to $2,000 a pound. Occasionally, when we were desperate to supply Salt Lake in September and October before the trim, we had to pay $2,400 a pound for indoor weed. For those of you who don't know, indoor-grown weed is always much more expensive. As far as commissions go, the main broker usually made the same amount as Bob and I did, basically $100 a pound. If Trey brokered 93 pounds and we carried it back to Salt Lake, we both made $9,300 a piece after expenses. Not bad for a 3 to 4 day work week. I loved working for Tiny too. He wasn't a cheap ass with Bob and me. He always fronted the rental car, the food, and the hotel expenses. I had heard a lot about other head guys that were too cheap to do that for their drivers, to front the expenses. But the way I figured it, you get what you pay for. If you have some hopper who owes you and he needs to pay off his debt to you, and you have a guy like that fronting the trip, he's out there on the interstates wearing his dreads and driving his personal Toyota Tundra whose plates are expired with the load sitting in the toolbox. Don't be too surprised if he gets pulled over for following too closely. Tiny was kind of reluctant to let Mom and Dad drive for him because, we weren't one of the cool kids in his crew. But his usual driver, his nerves were getting frazzled from driving too many trips. Tiny tried getting one of his Vermonsters to drive for him, but that Vermonster froze up. That's a whole different story. So we ended up driving. Well, anyways, this episode is chock full of details, and I hope I didn't go on too long. Golly, I could go on and on about this stuff. I love it. Did I tell you how much I love doing this job? Oh yeah, I guess I did. Well, anyways, stay out of trouble. And whatever you do, don't do anything I would do. We'll see you later.